My name is Nina Munday. I'm the manager of 5 Center for Equality. So before we actually go into the presentation about the data that we have within 5 Center for Equalities, I thought just to give you some background information about the organization. If you haven't heard of us, that's perfectly fine because we only just started 2014. And unlike many kind of like voluntary organizations, the need wasn't identified by the communities. Actually, the creation of 5 Center for Equalities was created by 5 Council. It was the local authority that identified that there's a need for an organization who can look after all the equality interests within 5. You know, because there's been in the past, there's been various organization kind of looking after different strands, but they felt with the Equality Act and it'd be more advantageous for an area like 5 to have an organization that look at the all 9 protected characteristics. And I can go into that later as well. So we are set up to really to make 5 a fairer place to live, work and study. So that's the aspiration for almost every single local authority in Scotland. Our job is not there to really deliver any particular services, but we're here to inspire and enabling people to take action. So it is about that mainstreaming. So rather than seeing equality as an add-on or a separate thing, it's actually how do we incorporate that into everything that people do in their daily life. And it's about people taking action, so everyone has the responsibility. And we're also here to trying to create this harmonized and collective voice. So, because within the equality movement, often you will have groups that speaking of one issue and then they all want to be heard and they all want to be seen that their issue is actually a lot more important or have been neglected. So we're trying our best to find what are the common themes that are affecting all the different protected groups. And it's about championing equality, diversity, inclusion, and social justice together. So I think some of the values that we have very much mirror what the open government, the data sharing, you know, it's about honesty, integrity, about respect. And we're hoping that everybody that we work with share those values as well. And then so because of that, and one of the key things that we do is about knowing what data we have and how to go about sharing those data, because I think it is important that, you know, a lot of things is about helping people to make informed decisions. And I think within not focusing on the PB, but using PB as an example, I think there are a lot of data that we have, but we don't often use. So rather than saying who's engaging with us, as in who turned up at the event, we should have some data that we should know about who's not engaging and what data we don't have. And so at that point, I'm going to transfer that over to Elric, I think. Yep, that's it.
So equality data. So the first thing that, if you ever try to search for it, that you'll get straight away is that it's very, very, very diverse. It means a lot of different things to everyone, because depending where you are, equality means a different thing to you. So the one thing that we as the organization realize is the diversity of data that exists when we're trying to tackle something as abstract and high level, which is equality. First thing that you have is obviously the diversity. But who creates the data, who manages it, who stores it, who administers it, who releases it from time to time. That's the first thing I've acquired as I started working with 5 Center for Equalities. There's just so much of it. It's not necessarily done in the same way, but you need to find a way, a common theme, and you need to try and string it together. That's one thing. The second thing that we found is silos. Seriously, you wouldn't believe how siloed some of this information is. There is a let's say, trend towards opening up and sharing information, but very, very, very quickly, it gets shut down. And it's quite odd in some ways because a lot of information is technically public domain. It is technically public information, but it's not readily accessible. There's a lot of protocols, there's a lot of like trying to knock at doors, ask, this information about, let's say, local, let's say, disadvantaged communities, could we know a bit more about it? It becomes very difficult to get. There's all kinds of reasons for that. One, maybe it's sensitive, but some other levels, it might be, maybe someone is going, well, if I release that, I might look bad. I don't want to, I'd rather this information just didn't surface or whatsoever. Unfortunately, that's something that still happens. I'm not saying something new there. I think most of you must have seen this. But anyway, so silos of information is a big, big problem. But when we're trying to do something as high level as working for equality, we should try and open up these silos, and we should try and get some commonalities. And that's something that we try and work on. Now, one thing that's really interesting that's happening at the moment, which is helping that a bit, is there's loads of different frameworks at different levels of public administration and government, local democracy, and all that are aligning themselves with each other to a certain level. So at a global level, you do have SDGs, that is something that Sustainable Development Goals, that inside it has indicators. A lot of it has also to do with environment and all that, which is not traditionally linked in with equality work or equality data, but it actually, a lot of it goes in common. A lot of that has got to do with gender equality, but beyond that as well, with also local participation, justice, and everything else. In the UK, across the UK, the main framework is the Equality Act, and Nina's going to go a bit more in detail about the Equality Act later on, where it creates a single framework of what are the protections against discrimination that certain sets of people have. That links with obviously equality data, equal monitoring, and which is seen as sensitive information. In Scotland, there's the new National Performance Framework. That came out, it's quite small, but anyway. All of these overlap. There's a lot of common data, statistics, measures and indicators across all of them. And us in Five, that's us, we work at a local level. What we try and do is that we take all these frameworks that tend to see things at the big picture and say, let's bring this to the ground, which is the theme of today after all. Can we see this in our communities every day? Does this information that we already have, does it match the reality of the people that we know? The groups that don't turn up to big events, to PB, to you name it, all the events where it's actually accessible and you see your usual suspects. We take this data and we say, does it match? And we interrogate these communities that are left out. So that's something that we do, and we found a few things, but I'm not going to get too much into that. But it's based very much on the Equality Act. I'll pass back to Nina to talk a bit about the Equality Act, maybe.
Right, the Equality Act is here to kind of like strengthen and harmonizes all the previous equality legislations. I mean, I'm sure many of you are aware that we used to have the Race Relations Act, Sex Discrimination Act, Disability Discrimination Act, the regulation for age, regulation for sexual orientation, and so forth. And so we needed something that could harmonize and help people to understand, what protections they have. And then it is still very much about promoting a fair and more equal society and protect individuals from unfair treatments based on these protected characteristics. Age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion, belief, sex and sexual orientation. So I'm sure that many of you are already quite familiar with that. But if you wanting to find out a little bit more about the Equality Act or any of the protected characteristics, do let us know. The reason why we do kind of emphasize on the protected characteristics, because that's what govern our work. And in many ways that kind of define how we section the statistics in the Equality in Five report. Mm-hmm. So I think that's
These are big themes. They are common themes. As I say, they run across all kinds of levels. There's tons and tons of data available about it. Unfortunately, what we find really quickly is how do you sort this out? So how do you make sense of it? So we use a very simple framework. As I say, it's the Equality and Human Rights Measurement Framework. We organize things on 6 domains of education, work, living standards, health, justice, personal security, and participation. And then we look at the kind of indicators that exist across all of them. And then we try and find out what's happening at Scotland level, UK level, and where we work in 5. And then at some point down the line, if things go well, we'll be able to work at a very, very, very local level, locality level. The problem that it does very quickly is that the complexity of it is mind-boggling, because if you imagine you're measuring educational achievement of every single person, of every single age group, of every single type of disability, of every single type of sexual orientation, it becomes astronomical. Researchers like a big matrix of data. It is an immense matrix of data. It is possible to do. The thing is that it's not difficult to think what it represents as a matrix. You can just say, oh, this is all the data space that exists. If we track all that, we'll be able to actually really know the state of equality, or at least that exists with public record, that is public data. You know, these are technically legislated for. The thing that we find out though is that there's a lot of gaps. That's the main thing. We went through that exercise and we actually said, right, okay, let's find out what do we know at local level, or even anywhere, at any level, what do we know about, let's say, educational achievement, and let's say disability and gender. As soon as you cross them over, it disappears. The information is simply not recorded. So these are just some things. As I say, I've mapped out all the stuff that we don't know. Despite legislation at UK level or Scottish Government level, we don't record information, you name it. Gender, maths proficiency, not only the number of enrollments in STEM subjects for disability, ethnicity, and gender, but there is no publicly accessible information about proficiency. So if you think about it, it's as if a lot of these movements towards trying to make equality data more useful, it's halfway there. It's like it's a half effort. There's a bit of information there, but we should just encourage the people that hold that data in their silos. Say, oh, go on then, share the rest of it. Maybe you don't have the time to work with it, but out there's activists, there's like local community groups and all that, and charities, anyone who's actually wanting to try and reform and help, they would like to use this. So if we had a bit more information about math proficiency, for instance, we could create way more programs that would be creative outside of the current systems. It exists everywhere. It exists in work, in living standards. Someone has this information. It's just not easily, readily, publicly accessible in a way that allows and fosters innovation, like in civic society. So this is where our exercise of actually trying to find out what exists, really, when you put all these frameworks in real life at local level, there's a lot of gaps. We can do the effort of actually knocking at the council departments, the specific schools that might have this information, but it is not something which is done uniformly across all local authorities or by principle in local government. It's understandable, it's a lot of work, but in some ways it's like shooting yourself in the foot, because you could actually use that information to actually mobilize more people around you to actually go forwards. So should we talk a bit about some things that we know, that we found out?
We do encourage you to go on our website and have a look at our Equality in 5 report. It's 220 pages, so we do not advise you to print them. And the report is updated every 6 months. And usually around that time, I kind of having to manage Elric's tantrums, you know.
It's bad.
But and I kind of remind him that it was him that actually said that he would do that. At no point did I say he has to, but he wanted to do it. But I think it is like working through all the data, and so we have some a lot of really good tables already in the report that has been quite useful for a wide range of organizations. So recently, I gave a presentation to about 150 employability services in 5, just to kind of highlight, not about celebrating. I know that sometimes it sounds really bad. It's like it's good to celebrate the successes that we have, but also it's also important to remind ourselves where the gaps are. And as you can see, with the reason why we show you this slide here, to show you the kind of the results by ethnicity, and you can see that certain groups that actually are outperforming the kind of the white Scottish. However, but then when you look at the economic activity, and then is kind of dropped quite significantly among certain groups. So interestingly, I mean, Chinese probably live up to their reputations at being the school, kind of high achievers, and then they continue to be students. But then when you look in the 5 context, we have one university that is like St. Andrews University. So we potentially could be losing a lot of kind of, as they call it, the brain drain. And so it's like we need to look beyond about, again, who do we have, but who do we not have? You know, if the employability rates suddenly drop quite significantly, you know, and you look at it, again, I think Arabs and Chinese are, you know, more likely to be students. So does that reflect in the actual employment statistics? Not really, hence that's why Scottish Government now has a separate framework to improve the employability of a whole range of minority ethnic communities. So when we look at employment rate by religion, again, if you look at the ratio for some groups, it's kind of 50%. So it's 1 in 2, you know, potentially unemployed. And that's the Muslim. So again, could that be explained by, you know, Islamophobia or and then when we look at the rate of employment, gender, and the pay gaps, in 5 actually, I think this one I'm not familiar. Yeah, I think in 5 the employment rates for women are lower compared to the men. You know, and then also the gender pay gap is 18.9% for women between female and male workers in 5. So what I highlighted was in that conference was like, you know, women doing the same job, but then actually we're getting paid much less than our male counterparts, even though the actual majority of people in that conference were women. So there's some things not quite right, you know, in terms of the local stats. And then I'm not saying that local stats are not quite right. In terms of like the picture, it kind of highlights that there are certain issues that we need to address, because I think gender equality, people often think, oh, but then we have made quite a progress with that, surely. But then the reality, the stats are telling us that we're still quite a long way to go, especially when you look in areas such as 5. And then the student enrollment, on this side is this student enrollment for the 5 college. And you will see that it's only like 2.4% that enroll in 5 college. And then that again, it highlights that, I mean, we already know in terms of the migration by ethnicity between the age of 18 to 25, we've already seen a lot of young people of all ethnicity kind of move out of 5, probably most likely to attend university elsewhere. So then if we want to create this like inclusive growth within 5, then we need to consider what can we do to attract the young people to remain in 5. And then when you look at the modern apprenticeship uptake, it's only 0.6%. You know, this is quite a significant, much less than the population size within 5. I think if we look at the minority ethnic communities, it's about 4%, isn't it? 4.7, yeah. So the uptake of the college places and modern apprenticeship, significant, much less. And then also when you look at the modern apprenticeship uptake between males and females, again, there's less women going into the modern apprenticeship.
Okay, so these are just some extracts. I say it's like there's a lot of this information where we do profiling. We look at what's the local population supposed to be like, what is it actually like in organizations, in institutions. We notice the gaps in between. A big theme that exists is obviously the pay gaps. That's something that more and more is becoming part of, well, say, a easy use of equality information, where people really understand it creates an impact, the pay gap between, let's say, the classic one is the gender pay gap, so we talked about that a bit earlier on, but there's also you might have heard it this year, like the day of the year, where technically women have worked for free until they start to catch up until the salary of women. So that's another way to think about it. The ways that are really powerful to actually get the message across. Things aren't quite right. They really are not quite right. Now, a lot of approaches to data that we have, I mean, not us as organizations in general, is that we tend to just measure one characteristic of a person and then just slap on some kind of reasoning behind it. There's a big problem with that. The classic example is when you start to cross over intersectionality of data. So as soon as you cross over, let's say gender, what jumped from the screen? Okay, but gender and disability. Okay, for instance, if you have a, oh no, that's it, yeah, jump. So this is pay gaps with the crossover between gender and disability. So if you have a male, non-disabled man, and a man with a work-limiting physical disability, there's a pay advantage of 13.6%. That's actually quite what most people go, okay, that kind of makes sense. There is a certain disadvantage against disabled people in society. Somehow, it's not fair. I'm not saying it's fair. I'm just saying it reflects what people think, and more or less it makes sense. And then when you look at what happens when it's looking at women, the pay gap is much smaller. Now, this is just what the data tells you. It doesn't mean why it's actually happening. That actually, the reason why that happens, you take one step back. There's already a pay gap between men and women. So the moment that you combine it with disability, that reason behind it disappears. So it's good to have this data, but it doesn't really tell you the real story. You need to have some kind of interpretation and someone who tells you what's going on. So I'll take another example, which is really quite interesting. The gap between a white British man and a British-born black African man is only 0.5%. So there's not that much difference, which is quite odd. Most people would say, what's happening there? But if you look at women, there's a massive pay advantage. Black African women has a 19.4 pay advantage compared to a white British woman. That sounds absolutely amazing. It's just, but that tends to be with the fact that a lot of black African women are really highly educated and do extremely well. However, it doesn't tell us the story that in the UK, for instance, black African women have 4 times the mortality rate of white women. So we do this thing that we just take a snapshot of data, we use it to sell our whatever we're selling, and then we forget some bits. So that's not too good. We need to do better than that. So I'll take a last example. Oh, I won't bore you. There's loads of examples like this. But anyway, so there's pages and pages where you can get the snippet of information, but we really need to start stitching it all together and then trying to get a better, fairer picture of what's going on.
Oh, and no, I think it is important to point that out. I mean, the second one, because that was the point that I would probably have raised. I mean, this is showing the pay gap between a white British woman and a female Pakistani migrant. So it's just highlighting that actually within the, even within race equality, there are differences. And I think if you compare to African, kind of British African, that tend to be more like London-based and in big cities, because in Scotland, we don't have a big number of the British-born African communities, but whereas we do have quite significant number of Pakistanis or Indians or Chinese up in Scotland, and you can see that actually the pay gap between a white woman and a Pakistani woman is 7.9%, but that's a national figure. And what we don't have is the kind of the local figure, what picture we need to take on board.
It's not that we could not get it, but it's quite complicated. We could ask for it, and then that's going to create additional work on someone, but we don't want to hassle. We're already quite pressed at the ONS and all that. So, but it could have been made by default accessible, then you would not create more work to someone to actually go and create special tables for you to actually access information. So that's just a design flaw.
I think what we already have highlighted locally is there's a lot of data that we don't systematically record. I think using Fife Council as an example, they record based on age, gender, disability and ethnicity. Majority of services do record those, but then they don't record sexual orientation, they don't record gender reassignment, and religion. These are the kind of things that sometimes they feel people are more likely to be offended if people being asked those questions. But then what we want to do is if we ask questions systematically, because I remember 20 years ago, even when they first introduced the race category, there was a lot of people who say, you can't ask that, or how do you categorize which ethnic group you use? But I think, we do need to move on to help the communities to understand that actually these questions is just really to help people to design better services. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's something that we do notice. There's just loads of missing information just because it's not being recorded and then it's not being shared. So it's a big problem. We're working with it, but I don't know if it's conclusions. There's a few things that I can put a few points. I've got a few points, and Ina's got a few as well. We could get a lot by opening up data, but the source itself is not very good. So there's a problem there, especially for equality. There's a lot of questions which are difficult to ask. They could lead to actually really positive policy changes, but because we don't ask the difficult questions to start with, we can't do a follow-up action later on down the line, might it be local government or activists or independent organizations. If we have detailed equality data, we could really spot institutional barriers really easily. That's a bit of a problem. But we need to shift away from this idea I was mentioning, this snapshot of data, just isolating a person in relation to one specific characteristic. Our work is across all the protected characteristics. There's a reason for that. Understanding the specific barriers that a person faces in their life is not something you can just make a snapshot of. You need to understand where that person's, I call it the cohort movement, where that person has traveled, the barriers they have faced throughout their life, and that actually creates a better understanding of basically the inequality the person might be facing. We were talking about PB earlier on. If you apply it to that setting, imagine a bit like the person who is extremely poor, who's got only disposable income of, let's say, £5, and then decides to give the £5 to a homeless person. And then someone's got a disposable income of £10,000 and decides to give £5 to a person. The value of that £5 is extremely much lower. And in PB, if someone has had extremely low social capital, cultural capital, or even basically accessibility to turn up at the event, but the choice that they make in that participatory action is actually of high value because they have thought very carefully or experienced extremely high barriers that actually make that decision really worthwhile. And we're missing it out because we're not making things accessible. So there's a problem with assigning value to decisions and then forgetting bits when they're convenient. Anyway, so I could go on forever about it. But some really interesting things that happen is the gender pay gap legislation and move. It is very top down. It is very much, it's the law now. If you have 250 employees, you will have to report your pay gaps. You will have to report how much you pay your employees. A lot of people are gaming that system. They're trying to find ways around it. It's not perfect, but it's created a movement to actually know there's enough of this. We should really tackle it. You've seen it the past year. Ever since April, there's been loads of the BBC, la-di-da-di-da. So yeah, anyway, so legislation can help. We need some kind of top-down legislation. If there's a gender pay gap, well, maybe we should do it across all of them. You know, disability, race, why not? Just really be open about data and try and be brave with what it brings afterwards. And the way forward, I think Nina wanted to talk a bit about a few things.
Yeah, I think after we present the data to people, we often ask us, like, you know, what's the way forward? What's the solutions? And I'm not particularly in favor of kind of like more specialist services because it's you know, it's demand on resources. When we're already talking about, you know, the resources are limited, and we don't really want to create, you know, specialist projects that depending on short-term funding, and then when that disappear, then you know, that client group then no longer supported by anybody, because even looking at the employability, one of the slides that is not on here is showing that you know, the uptake of modern apprenticeships have gone up with the disability groups. That is because in Fife we actually have a dedicated project that is about getting more disabled people modern apprenticeship placements. And but then if that project is no longer there, we probably might again see the drop. So we need to think about what would be the long-term solution. Is about changing the way that we operate the mainstream. Is that, you know, does that naturally come into people's thinking in terms of, if we're saying that, oh, we need to make sure our services like cater for everyone in our community, is that what they actually genuinely have in mind? Or do they just consult with the people who turned up to their focus group? So 20 people, or in that case 1,000, but then 1,000 out of 25,000, you know. So I think, and then, but so there's maybe some other issues that we do need to take into consideration if we are truly genuine about, you know, opportunities for all. And that inclusive growth, because data tell us one thing, and but then what we find is like it's quite easy to ignore data as well, because some of the pictures that we painted have been known for a long time. You know, in terms of unemployment rate within certain communities, the pay gap between, you know, the disabled and non-disabled. So what we're highlighting are not new issues, but then how do we really genuinely use the data we know to do something about it? So, thank you. Sorry for taking longer than expected.